Okay, good morning, everyone. We finally make it to the very last session of this congress. Four papers we are listening to today are about 20th century music. It's a pleasure to introduce you to the first one of the speakers, Carlos Villar-Taboada, who will be talking to us about exploring a new lyricism on Claudio Prieto's Second Symphony. So, Carlos, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I am very grateful for the organizers and to the scientific committee for allowing me to participate in this conference. After the pleasure of having listened to so many masterful lectures, I will be very grateful for any comments you want to make me after this presentation, because of course I follow the aim of improving my proposals, and I realize that I have still much to do and really much to learn. I will summarize my starting point. In the history of the 20th century Spanish music, composers belonging to the so-called generation of 51, whose leaders were Cristóbal Halffter and Luis de Pablo, both of them born in 1930 and recently deceased, were the protagonists of the updating of Spanish musical creation with respect to the international scene from 1958 on, after a 2 decades period of isolation back to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Despite a well-known assortment of personal approaches, their productions certified the existence of an experimental phase coinciding with Francoism. After the end of dictatorship in 1975, some composers abandoned the most radical positions in search of a reconciliation with the audience. Claudio Prieto, a prominent composer of this generation, is one of the most representative musicians of this shift around the 70s. His work can be classified into two periods. The first one, during the 60s and the 70s, exhibits an experimentalism whose main features concentrated around timbral research, join, indeterminacy and improvisation, extended techniques, usually with innovative music notation, and repetitive phrases linked to American minimalism, and maybe to textural or sound mass music. The second period, since the 80s, has been coined by the composer himself, new lyricism, stressing his wishes of recovering the communicability of his music to the audience. That proposal displays a continuity of the previous timbral experimentalism, to which traditional patterns respectful to the performers and solidly based on the concepts of beauty and expression are added. My main objective consists of demonstrating how the relevance of this new path has been mainly acknowledged since his two first symphonies. So next, I will quickly present a three-part talk with a brief survey on theoretical and methodological considerations, a synthesis of the main bibliographical and critical guidelines on the subject, and lastly, an analytical examination of both some selective precedent works and some examples from the Second Symphony. As shown next, topic theory and pitch classes theory provide some theoretical tools. Being me aware that the application of the topic theory to contemporary music is so interesting as some colleagues expose these days, but maybe it can also suggest, as a result, the convenience of combining it with some other semiotic views and conceptualizations, as Jerdingen's schemata or Gerard Genet's transtextuality theory. So, regarding to the theoretical framework and the methodology, I take some interesting tools. From stylistic studies, I adapt the Mayer's notion of compositive strategies as, and I introduce a translation from it, groups of decisions by means of which a composer, following or deviating from the patterns of behavior in a musical tendency, establishes the functions with which he organizes his music. Secondly, I utilized some concepts from the topic theory to concrete that those compositive strategies are precisely defined by groups of different topics, marks, and tropes. I think that they can be read or understood as ideologically biased. And I also use one classification of the universe of topics published by Agawu, but attributed to Mirka, I don't know exactly where, that distributes them as 18th century dances, ethnicities, and a diverse collection of styles. I adapt that taxonomy in order to translate it to the ideological frame of identity and nationalism. And I put together the dialogues towards its historical past, folk or ethnicity, and a heterogeneous complex of varied tendencies that constitute the avant-garde spectrum of musical trends. As topics mark the composer's creative identity, topics, compositive strategies, and the artistic identity of the composer perform a semiotic continuum, or topics shape the poetic bias adopted by composers and the artistic, their ideological positioning, allowing to evaluate the meaning of their musical creation within its cultural context, and the implicit dialogues maintained with their models. All the above is integrated into a theoretical analytical proposal, which I call the logo structure paradigm, which deals with various intersemiotic relationships that are understood as processes that generate meanings. It seeks to integrate in the same approach the double dimension, both objectual and concretized in its discursive articulation, and experiential, subjective, of music, assuming that the various factors that interact in their configuration maintain relations of dynamic interdependence, which is transformed over time. These relationships turn music into a privileged space of mediation due to the heterogeneity of the agents whose participation it manages to attract, and because it brings together processes, systems, and institutions that produce, reproduce, and consume music. Meanwhile, each subject experiences it from their context, in what could seem like a postmodern reading of Napier's prepartition. The three main spaces of negotiation of meanings that are reconciled in the law structure paradigm explore the relations of music with society and culture, with other musics, and with the individual. And respectively, I have called them semi-structure, morphostructure, and logostructure. Of course, I have developed more that sketch, though maybe it's not necessary now to deepen there. I have this published in some recent papers, and it's not necessary for the exposition now. Returning then to Claudio Prieto, as just defended, international benchmarks and bibliographical construction of the composer's figure interest since a semi-structural point of view, the relation of music to history and culture. Among the main manuals of 20th century music, coincidences about the most outstanding new streams point to contestations against Darmstadt and New York schools, diverse kinds of visit to the past, and minimalism. But timbral and texture aspects under different denominations can be found there. New virtuosity, electronic devices, extended techniques, innovations and texture, clash composition, and so. On the other side, if we turn now to Claudio Prieto's portrait by Spanish musicology, that reflects the just mentioned general tendencies, emphasizing his interest on timbral research, especially after his short formative stay at Rome, mainly with Petrassi and also with Maderna and Evangelisti, as well as a periodization bent to identify a stylistic shift around the 70s and 80s after his first symphony, a first moderation twist. Although surely it will be possible to extend this review the various judgments examined are sufficient to state that explorations on new notation and indeterminacy, minimalism and timbral inquiries to texture, extended techniques, and new virtuosity noticed in the top context of the international avant-garde find a correlate in Prieto's trajectory during the same time. So let's go to some analytical clues maybe. The first success was Solo a Solo, 1977, where that Prieto described as a piece that condenses these principles of timbral experimentation and expressiveness by superimposing two qualitatively contrasting monologues and looking for the search for new effects, assuming this expression is valid through the most diverse means at the disposal of the composer. There are some notational innovations put in the indications page. We consider that there is microintervallic extended techniques. Those for flute are the noise of keys, the use of harmonics, the use of glissandi. For guitar, there are also glissandi, the touch sul ponticello, touch on wood. And what we can see here is the realization of this notation, this innovative notation, with a characteristic which is very frequent in Prieto. Every pitch is against another one at a distance of a semitone or tritone. The effect is a very atonal and apparently complex sonority, but without the necessity at all of using a series or any other type of ordering. There you can see in green the tritones, in red the semitones. Every pitch has that kind of relation with the others. Every pitch sounds simultaneously or consecutively with another at semitone or tritone, clearly predominant intervals, with such an exhaustivity that it clearly reveals itself as a tactical option that allows the composer to sound out loud without serial or complex segments. In Algamara, we see a try of spatialization with these 7 instrumental groups. The piano part is written with virtuosity, and again, not conventional notation can be found. Repetition of mini ostinati are frequent, creating a sensation of a kind of minimalism. And segments with a pronounced textural density, as this one, with pitches ordered to promote chromatic soundings. In the virtuosistic piano piece, Well, in the first part, there is a chromatic pentachord. In the second one, a pitch is added to conform a chromatic hexachord. This kind of continuity is characteristic of the music of the experimental music of Claudio Prieto. The virtuosity of the piano part, the saturation of chromatic sets is also quite evident. You can see there that almost every group of notes, a consistent group of notes, has to do with a chromatic or an almost chromatic set. 3 chords, pentachords, hexachords, heptachords. in circulous circles, for example, persist the same direction, also in notation. But it shows a more precise calculation in pitch. We can see it here. If we amplify this, we can see that all the pitches conform a chromatic hexachord ordered by chromatic dyads. And that's the beginning, but all the development of the score has the same type of plan. And in other parts, there are also another devices. Here we have a chromatic trichord, afterwards another chromatic trichord, but the more interesting thing is the way pitches rotate every measure. So the calculation is extended to rhythm, but with a very simple technique, simple but very effective. With the same characteristics, he returns to the orchestra with nebula, with the same time of resources in notation, in trembling pitch, and so on. Previous symphonic experiences sparked the creation of his first symphony, an authentic peak of these years, according to the critic and the author himself, on which he declared, "It culminates a whole series of investigations around the possibilities of the human voice. The start of the work with the whole orchestra drawing the same line fortissimo, while the voices scream in a register as high as possible, shows forcefully what critics have referring to in a very violent and eloquent way." Is this? Sorry. It relapses with a vibration of different from that's shown in Nebulosa in the topic of textural music, but also in a way not void of surprise, echoes of the traditional, the articulation of the phrase, the distribution in parts with a balanced number of voices and the same symmetrical melodic contours, emerge among the avant-garde biases, metric imbalance, rhythm asymmetries, dynamic contrast, and dense atonal harmonies. And this is opening this other path. The critics recognized from the premiere the qualities pointed out, and despite the expressive forcefulness that oozes throughout its duration, placed it in the first symphony, the origin of a process that is extended until the second symphony. And this second symphony is the one plenty identified with the new lyricism of the composer after all the stylistic transition made. A stylistic transition which coincides chronologically with the transition in the politics environment in Spain, from dictatorship to democracy. With a duration of 24 minutes and selected to represent the National Radio of Spain in the UNESCO International Tribunal of Composers in 1984, it was premiered in the Teatro Real of Madrid. The score has no special indications, as before, nor notation of extended techniques. The composer's testimony about the work has nothing to do with technical aspects beyond admitting 3 parts. He speaks about getting up early, the pleasure of contemplating a sunrise by the sea while listening to the waves, and very symptomatically, it does not seem appropriate to explain to possible recipients of this sound message in its technical structures, which, although easy for the composer, would not help in any way to the understanding of the piece, in addition to the fact that in music, the only possible understanding passes through the ear. He claims to listen to music, but without explaining it. He just states that it belongs completely to the way of being of his last creations, in the sense of form, expression, and especially beauty, to which I profess more and more attention, his words. I want to show how, since a more conventional way of writing, the tendency towards timbral experimentation is still maintained as far as the use of repetitive obstinati that permit to create dense textures by accumulation. But there is more melody, more regularity, and a kind of synthesis between experimentalism and traditionalism. The first measures are static for 5 or 6 minutes with this kind of configuration. After 5, 6 minutes, there is a climax by accumulation. Always employing repetition. Occasionally, we can find some textural solutions with very dense sonorities. A kind of tractava melody. But repetition makes it more stable. And well, sorry, I have to conclude. Confronted with the composer's comments, critical judgments, and technical examinations of his scores, it's time to elaborate a final reflection of the whole. Although from a very selective perspective, this brief analytical survey through the creative journey of Flavio Prieto has fulfilled the goal of making an analytical contribution to the study of one of the most outstanding figures in contemporary Spanish music. And the hypothesis formulated at the beginning has been demonstrated, since it has been proved how several of the trends seen at the forefront of the international panorama can be clearly detected in their approaches, stylistically cohesive around the timbre. This was revealed as a source of renewing approaches to the musical language. And in addition, both testimonies of the composer and the statements of critics reinforced this position. A multiplicity in the timbre resources used is verified thanks to the use of new notational spellings that allow the introduction of extended techniques, micro-intervallic gestures, and virtuosity. In addition, the influence of the avant-garde is diversified because the repetitive coexists, linked to minimalism and indeterminacy exploit above all for the benefit of the rhythmic flexibility and to a lesser extent, the exploration of the textural. But at the same time, the rediscovery of melody, regularity and phrasing and conventional formal schemes with a lightening of textural density and emphasis on the atonal reconciliation with tradition. The theoretical framework maybe put the question. Sorry. In my opinion, authentic topics can be found in Prieto's music, derived from the reflective process aroused by his experience abroad, where he soaked up avant-garde techniques prevailing internationally, yes, but also of a freedom later longed from a long whole country, Spain, constrained by the Franco dictatorship. These topics grouped as a compact avant-garde compositional strategy, as a premeditated choice of the composer regarding how to address the public, exhale pretensions and memories about the daily experience of freedom. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for your really deep analysis. And I mean, it's not easy to get into that sea of music notation and to analyze it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have any questions. I would like to make a very good point. And it would be a question. What do you think is the relationship in this case between music notation and sound? Because so what comes first? Does first come sound and then music notation is a means to achieve that sound? Or maybe music notation can be also by itself a source of new sound experimentation?
Evidently, but the question for me would be mainly the first argument, in the sense that Prieto spent a short stay in Rome, and there he knew what was freedom in terms of politics and also in terms of artistry. There with Petrassi, he knew other new sounds for music. And these new sounds for music needed to introduce novelties in notation. It was a symptom for a desire of freedom, I think, because it coincides with, during panchoism. It's the way to be rebel in these years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your deep analysis and theoretical framework. I am interested in your remark about topics being able to mark the composer identity. Where do you think that the composer's identity remains? Because as you have explained, the author can follow different trends in different periods, depending on political, social circumstances or professional convenience. So I wonder if you could develop more that.
The way it was a kind of elaboration since the nationalism. My experience at university was that many works research on nationalist music, and the pillars of nationalism of music nationalism are three: history, past, folk, ethnicity, and the avant-garde idiom, to make oneself to be listened outside the own country. It is very curious to see how the classification of topics proposed by Agau and Danuta Mirka points out exactly that way. Exactly. There's a relation towards past, there's a relation towards ethnicity, and there's a relation to avant-gardisms, or whatever you can call them. The question is that it's not something static. It is constantly transformed during time. But you can make a photo of a repertoire, of a composer, of a work, if you want to, and analyze what kind of relations you can find in this repertoire, work, composer, looking to his relation or its relation to each of these ambiguous environments. And there it's possible to find many topics. The most difficult are those of the contemporary repertoire from after the Second World War. All the previous are very clear: neoclassicism, impressionism, dodecaphony, expressionism. It's very easy to locate them. The problem is with the more recent ones, because I think that sometimes you can identify a gesture as being minimalistic or as being characteristic of textual music, but maybe has no meaning or no not a clear meaning. Not a clear meaning. Okay. Yes.
Nicholas, great paper. I appreciate also the introduction to Claudio Pietro. I've never heard him before, and it's really neat. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You mentioned briefly when you were talking about the Second Symphony about I guess this dialogue between experimentalism and traditionalism. And when I think about traditionalism for kind of Spanish art in the 20th century, I think back to Casitismo. kind of in the earlier part of the 20th century. I was wondering how much of that is still active in like the 1980s, and what you meant exactly about use of traditionalism in
Thank you. What I mean by traditionalism is the classical base, the classical fundamentals related to regularity, symmetry, and so on, and classical forms, classical ways and genres of composition. They can be found in Spain imperfectly in the 80s, as in the rest of the international panorama. And internationally, we have a leader as, for example, Ligeti, with his neo-tonalism proposals in the 80s, or writing again concertos and pieces with classical formal models. It's the same. And what you asked, neoclassicism is still alive. Probably because it's very useful in film music, for example. And it's a very clear box where you can introduce every kind of elements, of different elements, and they will place together quite well. It's still alive, but not in the main avant-garde.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Mario Lerena, who will talk to us about fanfarria and representation, the dynamic semiotics of a sound topic through Zarzuela Las Golondrinas, and how I just give you the word and shut up.
Okay.
Well,
buenos días, buen día. I have prepared my paper in Spanish, but I hope everybody can follow it more or less thanks to my PowerPoint. El propósito de esta comunicación es analizar la presencia y el significado de sonoridades tópicas de fanfarria en un título emblemático del repertorio lírico español, la zarzuela o drama lírico Las Golondrinas, estrenado de José María Usandizaga, estrenada en Madrid en 1914. Pero antes de centrarme en el estudio de esta partitura, me gustaría recordar pues, alguna información más general sobre el tópico de fanfarria, según lo encontramos en fuentes históricas y en fuentes musicológicas. Como sabemos, es bastante habitual relacionar estas sonoridades de fanfarria de metales con acompañamientos de percusión con el mundo militar o el mundo, la autoridad, con el poder, con la realeza, la alta nobleza. En el siglo XVIII ya la enciclopedia francesa lo definía como un aire militar con trompetas acompañadas de timbales, y lo definía definía su carácter como marcial y alegre, especialmente apto para la guerra. Si nos acercamos al lugar y a la época de la obra que voy a estudiar, vemos que Felipe Pedrell lo define también como una especie de aire militar o de caza, e incluso lo llega a asimilar a una banda militar. Bueno, de esta manera no es extraño que, pues, de acuerdo con esta tradición, los autores que desarrollaron la teoría de los tópicos musicales, pues vemos, por ejemplo, que ya Leonard Ratner incluyó la sonoridad de fanfarria entre los tópicos militares y de caza, señalando, bueno, pues su presencia en las cortes nobiliarias y aún sin negar su presencia también en otros ámbitos civiles. Y Raymond Monel también pues lo identificó con los tópicos militares, con la figura del soldado, y lo identificó también con los trompeteros reales y de la caballería, hasta el punto de que él considera que la fanfarria se convirtió en un símbolo de aristocracia. Por otro lado, también me parece interesante una reflexión, un debate que establece William Catley sobre la idoneidad o la frecuencia con la que encontramos señales, sonoridades de fanfarria, simplemente para marcar de manera sintáctica, casi sintáctica, el comienzo formal de una obra o de una sección. Bueno, en cualquier caso, es cierto que las fanfarrias se utilizaron precisamente para marcar el comienzo de multitud de ceremonias y, tal como nos señala la voz del Globe Music Online, no solamente hay que identificar la fanfarria con una señal militar. También me parece interesante que la voz del Grove apunta a un posible origen ibérico del término fanfarria, lo cual, sea cierto o no, lo cierto es que es un término con mucho arraigo en la lengua española y ya en 1611 Sebastián de Covarrubias relacionaba acertadamente el término fanfarria con fanfarrón, que es un adjetivo que muchas veces se ha aplicado a la figura del soldado, pero evidentemente tiene un sentido más amplio. También lo relaciona con fanfarronear, que es hablar desgarros y demasías. Y me parece interesante que establece una etimología falsa completamente. Él atribuye la etimología de fanfarria y fanfarrón al verbo latino forforis, hablar, que es la misma etimología, también falsa, que atribuye a todos estos términos, farandulero, farfullar, farsa, farsante y faraute, de manera que me parece interesante que de alguna manera está relacionando semántica, etimológicamente estos términos. Y es curioso cómo define faraute, que es el que hace al principio de la comedia el prólogo y trae las nuevas de lo que se ha de representar narrando el argumento. En realidad, la etimología real de faraute viene del antiguo francés y significa heraldo. Me parece muy interesante cómo también aquí encontramos un término que proviene del protocolo cortesano y real, y acaba siendo aplicado a un entorno de teatro popular, de comedias, que es exactamente lo que vamos a encontrar en el caso de la fanfarria. Su uso en espectáculos populares lo encontramos ya, por ejemplo, en El Quijote de Cervantes, en el episodio del retablo de Maese Pedro, donde Cervantes nos dice que al comenzar el espectáculo de títeres, se oyeron sonar en el retablo cantidad de atabales y trompetas y dispararse mucha artillería. Muchísimo tiempo después, todavía la escritora barcelonesa Ana María Matute pues recuerda como una evocación de su infancia la llegada a un pueblo en la sierra de una compañía de titiriteros que llegaban tocando el tambor y la trompeta. Podríamos encontrar muchos testimonios de este tipo, bastante recientes. La escena, por otro lado, es absolutamente similar a la que se recrea en la ópera Pagliacci de Leoncavallo, que muchas veces se ha relacionado con la zarzuela de las golondrinas. Al comienzo del acto primero y segundo de Pagliacci entran los payasos y suena precisamente una trompeta y un tambor. Vale. De manera que, podríamos definir un significado de la sonoridad de fanfarria simplemente como un marcador de que el espectáculo va a comenzar, y es interesante como lo encontramos en antiguos espectáculos cortesanos, pero ha mantenido su vigencia hasta la moderna cultura de masas, y de hecho es curioso que la tocata inicial de Orfeo de Monteverdi hoy en día todavía ha acabado siendo la sintonía que abre las emisiones de Euroradio, y el preludio inicial en tempo de marcha del Te Deum de Charpentier, tan solemne, pues todavía hoy abre las emisiones de Eurovisión. Incluso en el siglo XX se han escrito nuevas fanfarrias adaptadas a un nuevo medio de expresión como es el cine, con esta famosa fanfarria de Alfred Newman, que abre las proyecciones de las películas de la 20th Century. Es exactamente una fanfarria de este tipo lo que nos encontramos al comienzo de la partitura de Las golondrinas, en el mismo preludio. Vamos a escucharlo ya. Usandizaga emplea esta sonoridad tan rimbombante para presentar de manera enfática la que sería una de sus obras más ambiciosas y desde luego la más exitosa, la más aplaudida. Pero hay que decir que en origen esta música no fue escrita para orquesta, como la escuchamos aquí, sino que era la introducción de un himno coral con acompañamiento de banda y cornetas y timbales, que fue escrito un año antes, en 1913, para conmemorar un episodio local de las guerras napoleónicas y que bueno, había sido interpretado en la ciudad natal del compositor, en San Sebastián, en presencia de los reyes y cantidad de autoridades civiles, judiciales, militares, y en lo que de hecho la prensa calificó como la más grandiosa, solemne y brillante ceremonia que se ha celebrado nunca en San Sebastián. De manera que vemos cómo en origen esta música sí tenía unas connotaciones, o sea, una función de pompa y circunstancia y unas connotaciones heroicas, incluso militares, por esa alusión al episodio de la Guerra de la Independencia. En cambio, en el caso de las golondrinas, pues esta introducción tan aparatosa contrasta de manera irónica con lo que nos vamos a encontrar con la primera escena, que es un carromato de comediantes absolutamente miserable. Al final de la primera escena volvemos a encontrar una versión reducida de la fanfarria inicial y ahora, recontextualizada, podemos entender que la fanfarria en realidad a lo que hace alusión es a la llegada de los titiriteros que la protagonista, Lina, pues presenta de una manera muy idealizada por su vida libre y alegre. Bueno, efectivamente, justo cuando suena esta música, vemos entrar a tres titiriteros, que además el libreto señala que entran fanfarronamente y que vienen de realizar 35 pregones por el pueblo anunciando su espectáculo. Uno de esos titiriteros trae un tambor colgado del cuello y el protagonista, Puck, lleva en la mano un cornetín con el que en su romanza siguiente se va a identificar cuando dice que hay llanto y risa en mi cornetín, compara su cornetín con su propia vida. De manera que encontramos una asociación indexical, digamos, por proximidad entre el sonido de ese instrumento y el propio personaje del payaso. Bien, todavía vamos a encontrar en este primer acto una tercera reformulación de este mismo toque de fanfarria, pero más desnudo, y ahora ya de una manera con una referencia mucho más directa a su función original. Es una música, realmente aquí funciona como música diegética, porque mientras la protagonista Lina confiesa que está enamorada del payaso Puck, o escuchamos fuera de escena al payaso Puck tocando el cornetín y realizando su último pregón antes del espectáculo. Bueno, en definitiva, si recorremos en sentido inverso estas tres ocurrencias del tópico de fanfarria, vemos cómo se produce un deslizamiento semántico entre una asociación puramente icónica, el toque de la trompeta lo que representa es el pregón real que realiza el payaso, pero también puede significar por proximidad de manera indexical al propio payaso o al propio mundo del circo, a los artistas del circo, y de una manera más simbólica, como hemos visto al principio, que simplemente una señal convencional para marcar que el espectáculo va a comenzar. También podíamos intuir al comienzo en el preludio ciertas connotaciones heroicas inherentes al tópico de fanfarria en otros contextos, pero este tipo de connotaciones simbólicas la encontramos explicitada en una última fanfarria que aparece en el segundo acto de la obra, diferente, esta vez asociada a la protagonista femenina y que suena justamente cuando termina su representación y es vitoreada por el público para señalar su triunfo. El público grita bravos y vivas y suena una fanfarria que empieza a sonar en las trompas. Y en este caso ya no hay ningún tipo de coartada escénica que justifique esa sonoridad. No ha habido ni pregón ni hay ningún tipo de instrumento en el escenario. Bueno, a partir de este momento culminante de la acción, los personajes se enredan en una espiral descendente de pasiones y celos que lleva a su autodestrucción y a un final muy trágico y desolador. Y a partir de ese momento, el motivo principal de la fanfarria se integra en el tejido orquestal de la obra, pero ya no lo vamos a encontrar de manera reconocible como una fanfarria, no aparece instrumentada como fanfarria. Aparece siempre en modo menor y como un eco funesto. Lo encontramos al final de los actos segundo y tercero. Al caer el telón al final de la obra. Bueno, con todos estos ejemplos creo que se puede hablar de que Usandizaga realmente lo que realiza en esta partitura es una deconstrucción del tópico de fanfarria y de sus connotaciones heroicas y triunfalistas más habituales, un poco en consonancia con las palabras premonitorias que el protagonista Puck dice en el primer acto de la obra: la más triste de las tragedias es la vida. Y bueno, para finalizar, quería comentar que me resulta imposible no relacionar este carácter, digamos, decepcionado, trágico de la obra con la propia trayectoria vital del compositor, que fue tempranamente idolatrado como un héroe musical, tanto por el público como por la crítica, como incluso, como hemos visto, por las autoridades. Cuando Usandizaga estrenó el himno de 1813 que he comentado antes, se le concede una medalla de oro del centenario. Pero, sin embargo, él sabía que, bueno, tenía una tuberculosis galopante que le quedaba muy poco tiempo de vida y, de hecho, murió al año siguiente de estrenar esta obra con solo 28 años. La crítica María Muñoz definió su impresión el día del estreno de Las golondrinas, precisamente. Dijo que era tan triste, tan amarga nuestra exclamación al contemplar la figurita menuda y desarticulada del músico triunfador en medio de tanta gloria resplandeciente. Pobre muchacho, Usandizaga va a morir pronto, pensé. Bueno, y como conclusión, pues me gustaría señalar este significado alternativo del tópico de fanfarria, que ha sido un poco desatendido, creo, hasta el momento, al margen de sus connotaciones militares y cortesanas habituales, pues bueno, puede significar simplemente que el espectáculo va a comenzar o, en general, puede asociarse a la idea de un espectáculo de entretenimiento, artistas de circo o simplemente un comienzo. Por otro lado, me parece interesante ver cómo Usandizaga ejemplifica en su obra este deslizamiento semiótico de la referencia de un tópico musical desde una referencia inmediatamente icónica a una significación por aproximación indexical o incluso a un significado más simbólico, que es algo que Raymond Monell ya teorizó en su día en términos más generales. Y por último, pues me gustaría destacar el interés de estudiar estos repertorios, digamos, periféricos para comprender también el funcionamiento de los tópicos musicales, y me parece muy interesante ver cómo un tópico musical absolutamente clásico pervive en el tiempo y en diferentes ámbitos y puede ser empleado por un compositor pues de una manera imaginativa y personal para crear una expresividad que sea por un lado efectiva y al mismo tiempo personal. Y nada más, muchas gracias por vuestra atención.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Do you have any comments?
Congratulations for your excellent presentation. It's very clear, very stimulating, and you give us a very interesting insight of such a key work of our lyric repertoire. I have two questions. The first one, the Bravo and Viva segment, I think that had something to do with Hacha, with hunting.
Hunting, yes, sound more like hunting because the horns start to play. But anyhow, the number develops in a march rhythm. It's an ordinary march, and then other brass instruments sounds. So I think it's just a marker for triumph, for glory. Yeah.
Because what I was thinking about is the fact that some of the examples seem to be hybrid. With the fanfare being predominant, and maybe another more component. And what I was wondering is if maybe there are two different kinds of fanfare, really, because I can't see the relation between the military fanfare and this other one that is festive and brilliant, and
yeah,
in a way the opposite.
Yeah,
maybe there are two sides of our reality, and I don't know if you see possible to research more in that direction.
Maybe there are, of course, there's different kinds of fanfares. I think the sonority, the general sonority of fanfares function equally well in both contexts. For example, in the example of Alfred Newman's fanfare, I think that it would be a fanfare for a Te Deum, like Charpentier's Te Deum. And in the case of Usandizaga, it's true that we hear that prelude in a symphonic manner, and it might sound somehow different, but in origin, the same music was written for that hymn 1813 that we could also even link to other famous pieces linked to those wars are Beethoven's Victoria Battle or Tchaikovsky 1812, where also military trumpets appear. And I think that in origin, Usandizaga thought about that sonority in that tradition and then recycled for this very different world, in my view. And I think that that ambiguity functions very well in a work like Las Golondrinas, as was present also in a possible model that it was Leoncavallo's Pagliacci. The same joke is present in my view.
A great paper, but I especially like the tracing of the linguistic lineage of the fanfare, like the earlier paper. Was really interesting. I was struck by the year of the escola, 1914, and the idea that I know Spain was a bit neutral throughout this, but goes to the beginning of World War I, right? And the idea that perhaps this fanfare could be perceived as like this harbinger of violence. And not necessarily within the context of the stuff that you looked at, but maybe later on after that period. So have you seen any works that kind of point towards a more kind of violent meaning, more about warfare?
Violent meaning. Sorry, do you mean that
No, but I mean elsewhere. You trace this topic kind of after, like this idea of the fanfare meaning something more violent, more about warfare, other than like introductory for this, or as you talked about.
In Spanish repertoire?
Sure, yeah.
Well, there are other pieces where we can find this kind of fanfares as just an act of opening, as for example in Manuel de Falla's work, the three-cornered part. And I think it's interesting the way Manuel de Fallas used the fanfare in Master Peter's Puppet Show, because there the performer work is set in Carlomagno's court, and there is an interesting joke there, because Manuel de Fallas follows what I quote from Don Quixote, that at the beginning of the show we hear a fanfare, the Sinfonietta, I think, and it's like, it sounds like a martial fanfare, and I think there is an interesting reflect in the performed action with Carlomagno court. But there are other zarzuelas and Spanish popular shows in that time that used to be announced with a fanfare in the print.
Okay, I think it's very difficult when we find these musical topics that are so closely linked to a specific instrument, like maybe to try to change the timbre, the instrument, and keep asking ourselves if that still is a fanfare. That's an interesting way.
Well,
because
we can recognize fanfare motifs, for example, in piano pieces.
Yes. But when we have, in addition, the same instrument, like the same timbre, it gets maybe more difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult, and perhaps it's not what one thinks about in the first moment. But if you see the score and hear the trumpet signals in the prelude, we hear again. We hear clear heroic trumpets. Pa 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 pa. It's quite clear.
Yes.
But,
it's even dangerous sometimes. What you said is very hybrid. You traced the previous 1913 San Sebastian event.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when I was listening to it, first impression was not a fanfare, because I was feeling the dramatic. It was to me more like an overture in which we were getting some of the topics that were going to come before. I didn't know the operas, maybe. But I think sometimes it may be dangerous that every time we listen to these instruments, at the beginning, we are going to connect it to the.
But with a cymbal, redouble,
Yes.
and that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. But it was very interesting that semiosis of the in the piece that you analyzed, how it changes in the different appearances of that. It's very interesting. So
I think the way Sandizaga used this sonority is quite coherent and conscious.
okay, so our next speaker is Claudio Ramirez Uribe. Will talk to us about the guaracha.
Both speak Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Sí,
No,
podemos
Spanish.
hablar. Well, I will just make the introduction in English in case
Okay.
there's someone fine. He will talk to us about the guaracha as an example of the adaptation of Cuban genres in Yucatec's traditional music. I have to say that I really want to hear about this guaracha because that's really something that I don't know. So I'm really interested in knowing about that. Thank you.
Bueno, pues gracias por quedarse y escuchar por la gestión del Congreso. Bueno, pues voy a empezar hablando un poco de los. ¿Cómo? ¿Ya? Ok. Hablando un poco de los antecedentes históricos de la guaracha, ¿no? En el contexto local, ¿no? Primero, la región del sureste mexicano, o sea, la región de la península de Yucatán, a finales del siglo XIX y comienzos del XX, tiene un boom comercial bastante importante, gracias a la producción de la fibra de Denequén. Se atrae a un número importante de migración, tanto de industriales como de gente para trabajar la fibra de Denequén, que servía para la manufactura de sogas, cuerdas, antes de la invención de las fibras sintéticas, ¿no? A la par de esto, ocurre un fenómeno cultural bélico que fue denominado por la historiografía como la guerra de castas. Este conflicto contrapone a la población maya que vivía en un estado de esclavitud prácticamente contra la población descendiente de hispanos de la región de la zona urbana, de las zonas urbanas más pobladas, la ciudad de Mérida, la ciudad de Valladolid, el puerto de Campeche, ¿sí? Y sus aliados locales, población mestiza o indígenas denominados como ladinos o vecinos, ¿no? A la par de esto, ocurría también una importante relación cultural entre Cuba y Yucatán. Cuba también en este entonces estaba sufriendo la guerra de independencia y hubo también bastante desplazamiento de la población en general, pero también de grupos culturales y artísticos disidentes. Algunos de ellos encontraron refugio en México y empezaron a hacer giras en el sureste mexicano. A la par de esto y debido también al incremento, bueno, a la bonanza económica local por el Nequén, se construyen espacios para la importación de música no solo cubana, sino zarzuela española, ópera, ¿no? Hay una mayor recepción de este tipo de músicas y, bueno, empieza también la producción de estos repertorios, la producción local de estos repertorios. Las giras, o sea, esta es la ruta de las giras en el sureste mexicano de compañías cubanas. Algunas viajaban hasta la Ciudad de México, otras hacían más bien giras locales y regresaban a La Habana. Algunos músicos también decidieron quedarse, pero generalmente regresaban a La Habana. Estas son giras, por ejemplo, que hacían compañías cubanas o compañías ya mexicanas, ¿no? Bueno, sin llegar a La Habana, pero se quedaban en este tipo de ciudades del sureste y del Golfo mexicano. Los antecedentes musicales cubanos en la región son van años antes de 1880, o sea, en 1860 ya encontramos publicaciones locales con influencia cubana, como habaneras y danzas. Posteriormente, en 1880, que es cuando empieza la circulación de las compañías buco-cubanas, sobre todo la compañía de Salas, que fue la más conocida, empieza a aparecer el género de las guarachas, ¿no? O sea, como canciones cómicas, ¿no? En los entreactos de las presentaciones de los grupos cubanos. Aparece también en forma de registro escrito el seminario de José Jacinto Cuevas, donde la familia de este compositor, que era bueno, una familia de músicos, presentaban sus composiciones. Ahí empiezan a aparecer los partituras, los primeros danzones yucatecos, de otro tipo de habaneras yucatecas y de danzas. Y bueno, también en el ámbito más popular, los carnavales meridanos, que aglutinaban al grueso de la población y se componían danzones, danzas, guarachas, para estas celebraciones. Y destacan sobre todo las comparsas y compañías que organizaba el músico Cirilo Vaqueiro Preve, que bueno, tomó el apodo maya de Chancil. Y pongo, bueno, en la izquierda los diferentes patrones rítmicos de los géneros cubanos que fueron llegando en el siglo XIX, final del siglo XIX. Ahora, gracias a los antecedentes que están ocurriendo, o sea, la guerra de castas y la producción del Nequén, surge la necesidad de crear un nuevo status quo cultural. Entonces, el teatro local comienza a introducir temáticas donde se incluye lo mestizo, donde se incluye lo maya, para crear un personaje que pudiera amalgamar los distintos estratos étnico-culturales de la región del sureste. A pesar de que sigue siendo una región sumamente racista, empieza a haber esa inclusión para tratar de crear un estado, digamos, de mediación entre los grupos oprimidos y los grupos opresores, ¿no? El mestizo tiene esta función homogenizadora en Yucatán, y destaca, bueno, también que empiezan a aparecer no solo las temáticas mestizas, sino la citación de la lengua maya en el teatro. Los personajes también empiezan a tener nombres mayas, y bueno, la cultura local empieza a autoidentificarse también como heredera del mundo maya. Ahora, para el análisis de esta guaracha, bueno, ya voy a leerlo. Con la composición y uso de música de origen cubano en la producción artística local, el germen estaba plantado para su posterior desarrollo en el teatro yucateco, y ciertos personajes y temáticas costumbristas se comenzaron a configurar al son de músicas de influencias cubanas en las últimas décadas del siglo XIX y comienzos del XX. Es posible percibir en estas temáticas cómicas y costumbristas la influencia bufa cubana, que quizás no llegaba a consolidar tramas dramáticas más elaboradas. Ejemplo de ello es la guaracha de Chancil, la mestiza, ritmo de habanera, y la que se analiza en este trabajo, Potembosch. Sobre estas dinámicas, Pablo Vera señala que, y cito, como el sonido en sí mismo es un sistema de estratos múltiples, los códigos estrictamente musicales también son variados. De ahí la posibilidad que tiene un mismo tipo de música de interpelar a actores sociales muy distintos, sobre todo si tenemos en cuenta que dichos códigos, lejos de reforzarse el uno al otro, muchas veces pueden ser altamente contradictorios. Fin de cita. Atendiendo al análisis que propone Leonard Meyer en su libro Emoción y significado en la música, es posible asumir como códigos simbólicos a las células rítmicas con las que se estructuran los géneros cubanos de moda en Yucatán a finales del siglo XIX, los cuales tienen un significado concreto y consolidado dentro de su contexto musical, y por un consenso general también unas expectativas determinadas entre los músicos y los escucha de dicho contexto. Al mismo tiempo, la expectativa, o sea, lo que se cree o se espera que se escuche, es aprendida con los modelos psicológicos de percepción, cognición y respuesta. Por lo tanto, también lo que se conoce como comportamiento asignativo es cultural. Gonzalo Camacho, por otro lado, ha propuesto que el impacto comercial y la globalización de determinado género musical fuera de la cultura de origen y su apropiación por otra, ocasiona que se extrapolen y estereotipen ciertos patrones o elementos musicales para adaptarse de manera exitosa al mercado en el que se aspira a tener éxito. En este proceso ocurren cambios y transformaciones de ciertas características originarias. La relación de los planteamientos de Meyer y Camacho con el presente estudio radica en el uso de las músicas cubanas en Yucatán. La música de la isla caribeña era un éxito popular en prácticamente todos los estratos sociales urbanos. No obstante, al ser dos culturas diferenciadas, donde la cubana representa una importación lúdica, los símbolos musicales y su uso en el contexto yucateco se fue modificando del originario cubano. En esta semiósfera plural caribeña se percibe el uso de las estructuras y patrones rítmicos, así como los géneros cubanos para referenciar símbolos y contextos yucatecos. El negrito del teatro bujo cubano comenzó a convertirse en el bochito y mestizo yucatecos, e igualmente los elementos musicales de la mayor de las Antillas, como las células y patrones metrorrítmicos del danzón, la habanera o el tresillo cubano, son absorbidos y modificados por los compositores peninsulares. Estas influencias musicales cubanas se encuentran de Cotten-Bosch, guaracha yucateca compuesta probablemente alrededor de 1890 y 1910, por Cirilo Vaqueiro Preve Chancil, quien era un compositor blanco y culto. Bueno, él era hijo del comandante, bueno, el encargado del jefe de operaciones del puerto de Campeche. En ella es posible apreciar la interacción de componentes musicales externos a la península con situaciones o elementos culturales populares locales. En este caso, el componente local es representado por la letra, ya que se trata de una quintilla con repetición de un verso, hash alte bachten kabin, pero dime por qué te vas, en maya, seguida de la letra que traduce el maya al español. La nota crítica de la edición Analizar señala que se trata de una versión en partitura realizada por Pedro Carlos Herrera, quien utiliza como referencia una grabación realizada en 1970 y conservada en cassette. La referencia alude a Julia Vaqueiro García Rejón y el título del cassette es Canciones de Chancil. Este se encuentra en el archivo de Rosario Cáceres Vaqueiro. Por otro lado, Enrique Martín apunta a una fuente posterior, se trata del año 2002 con la rondalla Yucatán. El autor recalca la conservación de esta guaracha gracias a la tradición oral, lo que coincide con la nota crítica de la edición para piano y voz de Pedro Carlos Herrera, y cito: la letra, según la grabación de los decanos para esta publicación, que es la que tenemos en pantalla, Alfredo Gamboa Rosales, primera voz del trío, la aprendió el trovador Demetrio a mediados del siglo pasado. En la versión de Julia Vaqueiro García Rejón, el primer verso es Tuxcabín, niña hermosa, Tuxcabín, y el séptimo, su correspondiente traducción, ¿dónde vas, niña hermosa, dónde vas? Por lo tanto, bueno, fin de cita. Por lo tanto, no podemos olvidar que estamos analizando una edición que parte de la tradición oral. Con esto se hace un llamado de atención a que no se trata de una versión definitiva y por consiguiente podemos encontrar versiones distintas de esta guaracha. No obstante, esta característica es un testimonio de la continuidad dentro de la memoria y transmisión de las tradiciones orales en la región, la cual ha quedado registrada en la edición que se está analizando en este trabajo. Concretamente, esta edición se realizó para voz con acompañamiento de piano y está compuesta en compás metrorrítmico de 2/4 y en tonalidad de do mayor. Su extensión es de 22 compases dividido en 6 de introducción, 8 para la parte A y 8 para la parte B, con sus respectivas repeticiones. Toda la forma con sus repeticiones se repite íntegra al cantar en español. La introducción se utiliza al finalizar la parte B como un puente para regresar a la forma da capo. Esto con el propósito de que la letra, en un principio cantada en maya, sea reinterpretada en español. Armónicamente, la introducción cuenta con la particularidad de iniciar en el primer compás con el cuarto grado de la tonalidad. Subsecuentemente, la misma figura, tanto rítmica como melódica, es llevada un tono más arriba, el quinto grado dominante, para que en el tercer compás se presente la tonalidad principal de la pieza. Por lo tanto, la introducción se trata de una cadencia cuarto, quinto, primero que reafirma la tonalidad de do mayor. Esta introducción tiene relación con el recurso formal de la pasacalle cubana del siglo XIX, la cual consistía en una introducción que era usada también como puente instrumental entre las dos partes de una canción y no de un estribillo de danzón, el cual siempre está formado por 8 compases y que además está sujeto al patrón o la metrorrítmica de dicho baile. Este patrón está conformado por 2 compases, en este caso 2/4, como veremos más adelante, con una estructura metrorrítmica de un compás con una figura rítmica de cinquillo cubano y otro de 4 corcheas. Continuando con la cuestión del uso de los patrones metrorrítmicos, podría considerarse esta guaracha como un híbrido, pues utiliza muchas veces de manera simultánea varias de las células metrorrítmicas de las músicas cubanas de moda en Yucatán a finales del siglo XIX. El acompañamiento de la parte A tiene las características de la habanera, basada en la célula tango o patrón de habanera. Por otro lado, en la parte B, La estructura metrorrítmica que impera en la melodía es la del danzón, ya que está basada en la célula metrorrítmica de este baile, con la salvedad que el compás de 4 corcheas o de estabilidad rítmica, en contraposición a la síncopa del compás anterior, que tiene el cinquillo cubano, presenta una figura rítmico-melódica de negra con puntillo corchea en el compás 16 y negra y silencio corchea en el compás 18. Solo en el compás 20 presenta las 4 corcheas. En el acompañamiento del piano de la parte B se presenta una alternancia en la mano izquierda entre la célula tango con el patrón rítmico conocido como tresillo cubano, el cual puede ser considerado una variante del patrón habanero. En los compases 19 y 21 también aparece en la mano derecha. Esta variación de figuras rítmicas puede ser motivado por el movimiento armónico de la guaracha en el compás 19, 20 y 21. Quinto 7 del segundo menor, quinto 7 primero. Finalmente, en el compás 22B se utiliza una figura rítmica de cinquillo cubano a manera de remate apoteósico de la guaracha. Como se puede notar, el acompañamiento del piano en la parte B basada en la célula tango y el tresillo cubano contrasta con la estabilidad estilística de la parte A, la cual se basa en el uso del patrón de habanera. Por el contrario, la parte B no respeta la célula metrorrítmica del danzón, presente de manera simultánea en la melodía. Esto crea una sucesión de compases de tensión rítmica que queda sin el reposo del segundo compás de la célula metrorrítmica del danzón en el acompañamiento, algo ajeno a la práctica cubana de este género. A continuación, se expone una tabla donde se pueden observar todos los elementos semiótico-musicales cubanos, patrones y células rítmicas estudiados en este análisis. Se especifica el lugar de aparición dentro de la composición y si existen modificaciones en los niveles de coincidencia rítmica con los géneros cubanos. Se aprecia cómo la música cubana o los elementos musicales cubanos representan al mismo tiempo una identidad étnica específica y al mismo tiempo están insertados en dinámicas globales y de interconexión cultural entre varias culturas. En la tabla precedente se clarifica cómo distintos patrones y células musicales cubanas desarrollados dentro de los géneros musicales del siglo XIX, danzón, guaracha, habanera, bolero, etc., fueron modificados una vez asimilados por los músicos y compositores yucatecos. Estos, a través de la imitación y la traducción de las músicas llegadas a Cuba, lograron crear un producto nuevo, reflejando su contexto social, el cual era diferente al de los cubanos de la época. En sí mismos, los elementos rítmicos cubanos no cambian, pero al ser insertados dentro de un código distinto, su significado se altera, creando nuevas referencias ajenas del producto original. Por lo tanto, podría pensarse que todos estos préstamos culturales no son otra cosa que un proceso de transculturación gestado en el sureste mexicano, proceso que fue sustentado por las élites locales y poco a poco fue cimentando las bases de una nueva identidad yucateca, identidad donde lo imaginario, lo mestizo y lo maya fue cobrando mayor importancia. Se estaba gestando, si se siguen los planteamientos de Joseph Martí, el inicio del desarrollo de una nueva música étnica yucateca, pues la canción, consolidada en el comienzo del siglo XX, otorgó una cohesión a la música urbana peninsular y una sustentación de políticas culturales e ideologías locales en torno a la identidad yucateca. Al analizar cómo es que se inserta la guaracha de Cotten-Bosch en la vida artística meridana de final del siglo XIX y comienzos del XX, se evidencia un periodo en donde se está gestando el antecedente, partiendo del grupo hegemónico local, del pensamiento maya indigenista por revolucionario de finales de los 1910 y los 20. De esta manera, se está ante un protorregionalismo cultural yucateco, en donde se está configurando una identidad local con préstamos musicales extranjeros. La conformación de símbolos identitarios locales son en Yucatán un entrelazamiento de influencias culturales regionales, nacionales e internacionales. Y bueno, antes de terminar, pongo la guaracha, ¿no? La versión que vamos a escuchar fue presentada, precisamente es la orquestación de la versión para piano, presentada en el auditorio de la Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán. Entonces están todos los patrones cubanos, pero cambia el sentido de estos patrones. Ya no suena a danzón, ya no suena a habanera, ya no empieza a tener un cariz regional distinto. Pues muchas gracias.
Thank you, Matthias. Do you have any comments on the presentation?
Well, thanks for your presentation of this new genre for me at least. Just skeptical and ignorant answer. Were those rhythmic patterns really news in Mexico in those years? There were not precedents and connected to that. Where they felt as an assimilated foreign pattern, or just accepted as part of the Yucatan's musical identity?
Yeah, so Mexico has, like, since a very large country, the foreign influence had different meanings, and they were adapted in a different ways. For instance, in Veracruz, danzón is played exactly as the Cuban danzón of the 40s and the 30s. And nowadays, the danzón veracruzano, it preserved most of the rhythmic Cuban patterns. And in the particular case of Yucatan Peninsula, since it was very far away of the center of the country, they had to create a very particular local identity, because to get by land to Yucatan, it was impossible until 1960 or something like that, because you have to cross the jungle and cross the mountain range. So the Yucatan held a very strong commerce with the Caribbean, with Cuba, with New Orleans, with Colombia, with many countries in regions in the Caribbean. And also they had the very important, strong influence of the Mayan culture. Like they're not now what people, they don't speak now. When they speak Mayan, they have their own particular way to portray the indigenous tradition, the local tradition, and therefore they had also a different way to adapt foreign influences. For instance, in another Yucatan genre called jarana, you can see the influence not of Cuban music but Spanish. In the jota, they have a version of jota in Yucatan with a different ensemble of instruments that represents a local identity. So in Yucatan, I think portrays in a very clear way how different foreign musical patterns were readapted and reused to recreate what they needed to be an identity, especially after these conflicts, Guerra de Castas, the Mexican Revolution. So yeah, I think that's answer your question.
Yes, my point is that we can find that kind of tango-like patterns almost all along Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So we often take for granted that they are also in Cuba, but
yes. Like for instance, now I see your question. No, in Mexico, what was more developed, and this is, you can search the book, is La binarización de los ritmos terrenales africanos of Rolando Pérez Fernández. In Mexico, the rhythmic patterns are mostly based on the and like this, the Mexican song, like maybe I can explain the piano. For instance, most of the Mexican music, traditional Mexican music, is based on how do you call it, like emiola and stuff like that. So and Rolando Pérez Fernández explains in that book that because of the African influence was not as important in Mexico, or not as important as has such a weight as it was in the Caribbean. The Spanish music prevailed. You know? So we still have the third. So imagine. That's what happened in the Caribbean, and for instance in Rio de la Plata with the tango, you have they changed it that this three. And that's due the African influence. So yeah, you had the precedence of all these rhythmic patterns all across the Americas. That's true. But the habanera as a genre and as a consolidated product was an importation from Cuba to Mexico.
Thank you so much for your explanation. Thank you.
Our next speaker, please correct me if I say wrong your name.
I am
Landsbergite?
yes, Jūratė Landsbergytė, from Lithuania, Vilnius, Lithuanian Culture Research Institute.
Yeah. You talk to us about Sound and Content, creative work with exit from music world by Lithuanian composers, Ricardas Kabelis.
Yes. You can next.
Yes.
Ričardas Kabelis. The flow of Lithuanian polyphonic song music sutartinės put to the test in the works of composer Ričardas Kabelis, born 1957, stemmed from the deep resistance to paradigm of minimalism and the need for alternative music aesthetics. He had to unleash the structural power from the traditions of conflict dramaturgy of various Western schools. That involved a couple of centuries: post-romanticism, modernism, surrealism, new romanticism, recomposition, music in music, minimalism. In that epoch, Lithuanian music became endless and peculiarly paradigmatic minimalism, with monotony of rhythm, and this process inspired Ričardas Kabelis to radicalize his own creative ways against narrative romanticism. The dire style context of the mental modes minimalism appeared better to be rejected in the name of structure and the power of intonation self, unique, unified space. Such a declaration of the interaction between creative freedom and systematicity began to emerge in Kabelis' works of the German Darmstadt period. The rejection of a Lithuanian context and aesthetic of music in the name of structural idea of the absolute intonation self. The paradigm of the intonation self was discovered as the Baltic music phenomenon, and its source was the theory of supporting tones of Julius Juzeliūnas, which combines the polyphonic song principles of Lithuanian folklore and sutartinės and dodecaphonic serialism. Kabelis, later inspired by Osvaldas Balakauskas as well, one of the most important transforms of the new Vienna school in Lithuania, who created its own harmonic system as systematic distribution of home, focused on the uniqueness of Lithuanian national folkloristic modern, using image of sutartinė songs and even transform this as utopias or images of old tribes songs like archaeology or lies of Balticness in music. Their imaginary memory islands emerging from the discovery of intonation cells movements contain unique Kabelis style concept that pulsates with its own space, ornamentation, and great visuality and verbality in music form. The next. This main codes of Richard Kabelis music. The first Kabelis code is specifically the action, a departure from tradition, or a rapid liberation from context. It is linked to some association of punch or hit, some push, exclusion from the context, and then directly to musical gesture of rhythmic essence, distancing itself from the nature of the limitless melody and meditative landscapes. The second code is the integral or derived modus from the intonation cell, which structures the whole composition. The third code is transformation in space. It's structured from the cell, but transformation in sphere opens, the limitless sphere opens here. The uniqueness of sound's spectrality of this celestial dome and the alternative sacredness constructs the sphere as spatial force. A spatial case, this non-dynamism of the sphere is also called paradoxical theme. The fourth Kabelis code is a limitless dimension of national identity. Return to the homeland, to the context, and a paradigm of the symbol echoes of polyphonic Lithuanian folklore songs sutartinės. Several essential principles of the sound of the folklore music are also concentrated here: echo, repetition, rhythmic monotony, transformation of returning cells in circles, what leads into vision, sacred space with particular aesthetic motive of national identity, the revival of Baltic civilization. This utopia, like inspiring ideal of the dream hum of the pagan tribe, the island of longing has recently turned Kabbalic creative imagination. This time, repetitive sound note dissolved in the spheres of enlightenment. Kabbali's work, Mountain Round, for 72 flutes, 2016 created. This is not a touch with the dark, but is very common for Baltic self and dark historical experience. Each of these signs or codes is the subject of special attention, reopening into Kabbalist semiotics secrets. This semiotics became important issues, visual, maybe next one. This is some more. Next one. This is the visual circle. This is the partiture of Kabbalist work, confirmation of myth, of Baltic's identity, like eternal circle. And this is actual partiture of this piece. Visual and in the scores and verbal in even in author's comments overwhelm the musical image. Works can back on that. Some work. The works of first code, the leading to alternatives to minimalism, are related to the world of non-melody. It is rhythm, accent, and repetition of rhythmic figures. We can listen this first opus Servus. This piece created in Darmstadt period. As you listen, this rhythm, accent, and repetition of rhythmic figures they are in several works of Kabbalists, and they create musical images that are anti-narrative and somehow even verbal, entail acoustic transformations. Full of linguistic expression. The meanings of the word here undergo strange change and acoustic transformation that evoke different interactions between consciousness and unknown concepts, the musical meanings of verbality. This acoustic, this hum of space, awakened by rhythmic accent and rhetorical jest. You can listen 40 persische 40. This is one of the most exciting discoveries of antithesis here, is the anti-narrative of word meaning in music. It is the sound of linguistic expression in whispering and examples of word musicality. This piece, 40 persische for mixed horn, is composed year 2000. Second, here comes unique value of the detail for the absolute or so-called integral, the second Kabbalistic code. It is sign of existence of oneness, the unity of creation. The oneness became the philosophical essence of Kabbalist music, unfolding the idea of integrity of the phenomenon, creative systematism and structure from the folklore itself, following Luna's theory of selected tones. Kabbalist note it as motive and goal of his creative process. He said, the theoretical assumptions of my favorite structural integrity indeed lie not only in medieval quadrium, but also in Plotinus' philosophy. Plotinus' idea about oneness, all unifying phenomenon describing structure of creativity, by Kabbalists is called using the term integral, a special Kabbalist term for his music. The works that are unfolded following the principle of the universe of one detail are the Orion's belt or opus based on the model of the eternal cycle. One interesting example called the work Mudra, the third. The musical detail, the integral, oneness responds to the star principle, planet, life system, this versatility of the intonations, atom, reflects the philosophical uniqueness of Kabbalist music. It became the systematic principle of the sign, gesture, push, integral, paradigmatic line of creation, fusion with the breathing of space or the self-vibration. The integral can still be compared with the polyphonic chord of Luna, supporting or selected tones, or which with the principle of Heinrich Schenker analysis, or the principle of the Ursa's creative structure, Ursa's deep structure, from which the whole works genetically grows. This is a matter of organicity in music form. Third Kabbalist code or sign is the dream, this sphere, in which spatial vibration, pulsation, and the gesture of evidence of a self-life take place. It's also called paradoxical sleep, referring to its imperceptible cosmic fog, a certain swaying monotony, the all-encompassing swing of cyclically and silent of the universe, of spatial drone. It is also related to the controversy over Kabbalist style systematism versus chaos, or the opposite phenomenon or of asystematism or exclusion from the consistent system principle of rational control from the aesthetic context. Finally, it is one more displacement of another level. If the first was the antithesis to the complete systematization, the rational quadrium, which marks Kabbalist's creative methodology, and the conquest of space in lead to know her. This paradox among concepts. Among the walls of such paradoxical sleep is a very good example, the Bolle LT for Symphony Orchestra 2015. I can only broadly describe this work. It's very chaotic sounds, chaos, what is very rubbish hard to listen, and what abruptly interrupts emerging Ravel's bolero. This is some mixed hybrid form, very crucial for aesthetic image. The fourth, Kabbalist code includes the concepts of illusion and utopia. This is paradigmatic term of Lithuanian music toward the existence of Baltic tribes in the space of oblivion of history, which lays out of the sacred line of survival. The lifeline to the present continues from Bronius Kutavičius' last pagan rites, Jotvingi's stone, pantheistic oratorio as well, which this connection to global civilization with space-time of the illusionary paradoxical dream carries an important message about peaceful coexistence of nations, the religious integral of the global spirit and its universality. The fourth Kabbalist code became the formation of the Baltic identity, rising it from the depths of civilization, of music history. It could be named after his work for two pianos, Confirmation of the Myth, Mythos Sutvirtinimas, created in 2019. The composer discovered a system of archetypes wandering subconsciously, framing it as confirmation of existence of Baltic identity or Baltic civilization between East and West. Yes, we can. Next one. This is the partiture of this work. Exactly. The fourth Kabbalist code is code of codes, is formed the code of the whole, which can be called the Baltic civilization. I skip some my comments and go to Kabbalist comments. And this is between the transcendence of the memory of the science of reality and some vision of or hypothesis of Baltic civilization between East and West. Kabbalist comments of the main points of the concept of confirmation of myth. It's Kabbalist. Linking the three pillars of European harmony in their works, Richard Wagner, opera Tristan and Isolde, Alexander Scriabin's Prometheus, the poem of fire, and Fifth Symphony of Julius Caesar, Songs of the Plain. I researched the hypothetical idea of the unity of European music. Implementing the idea of confirmation of myth, I was looking for work by Julius Caesar based on his court and representing Baltic civilization. While search for work manifestation, I noticed that the Baltic space impressively exposed in the fierce songs of the plains is not adequately represented in the context of Eastern and Western culture. To this day, Baltic culture is believed to be consequence of intersection of East and West civilization. Meanwhile, in the historical thought and mythological narratives, the apparent contact between the three traditions testifies that the age is very similar. So we shall talk about equivalent Eastern, Western, and Baltic culture. This observation became the basis of the idea of confirmation of the myth. Discussing further the essential motives, the author emphasizes their sacred meanings and the profound sacredness of Baltic pantheism. Again, it is embodied in the sound of words. Here, the linguistic aspect, the mysteries of acoustic meaning of the word is born again. Kabalis. The first two syllables, kalnu kalnu, denotes the part of vertical projection of the plain and mountain. The image of the mountain can be found in Lithuanian folk song, the plain field behind mountain, lygus laukelis, aukštas kalnelis. After climbing to the top of the mountain, the person thinks himself in the center of the world. In mythology, it's sacred and safest place. The sky above the mountain and the hell down below are connected by one axis. The mountain is the spike of the axis. Amongst 200 white shrines, there are 74 mountains, the highest of which had observatories for heaven lights. In the Baltic mythology, the mountain is not only silent, formed by nature, but also a gateway to eternity. Etymology and mythology of the mountain, coming primarily from Bronius Kutavičius, left pagan right, continues through Julius Juzeliūnas Songs of the Plains, to Richardas Kabelis' confirmation of myth. The archetype of the mountain is associated with the dramaturgy of enlightenment, journey to the height, to the transcendent experience. Moreover, in the piece of music, this can be perfectly structured as a riddle of processual paradigm. The second significant sound word is morning, ritas. The meanings of the morning are associated with the perception of the universe and the world. Morning is the part of the day between night and noon. In the cosmological sense, morning is the space of all the first events or the primordial substance from which spiritual and natural reality are born. Morning is the sphere of the beginning and down of the circle of Reda, birth and death. In Baltic mythology, the morning is imaginable without the sun. Its rise signifies the time of the sacrifice, and spot is called sun or eye cycle. Nu, man pasakys, čia gi ne tu vadovausi. My sister.
No, because we have the closure.
Yes, okay. The morning sunrise to the sky as if the circle of the wheel, and the image of the morning cycle in Latin rota a rotation, and this constant change of event's height. This is an example part. And here is English word road, tag, in the concept of related meaning. Here comes the time for the initiative of the third sound word, yado. It is found in the meanings of refrains of polyphonic songs written 1849 by Nicholas Mežuolis, Yado, Yado, Yadžuolis. The composer notes that in some Indo-European language, the word Yado means mineral nephrite. In Turkish mythology, Yado is magic stone controlling natural phenomena. The connection with Lithuanian linguistic sense are obvious. It is adjective black, juodas, mystical color of the bottom of the depth. This is more mythological meanings. Ever the onagurs ancestors took the rain stone from animals' mouths to the stones that attract moisture and clothes. The link between Yado stone and animals is widespread among Kyrgyz people and so on. Yes, it's the last about this word. Kabali seeks to connect this space with global chord, the chord of Wagner, Tristan, described Prometheus, and Juseliūnas sutartinės frame tone. And about this meaning of circle is very important even in time of partiture of scores in Lithuanian music, beginning from Kutavičius' Pagan Rites, Magic Circle of Sanskrit, Tree of the Boat, and so on. And as conclusions, we can saying this is Kabbalist four codes are how like vertigos from themselves, like antithesis became integral, synthesis, and integral became clear, some space, unlimited space, oneness, and least is returning to the context, to the Baltic identity and local space.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the way. I thought for myself to discover this composer, which I didn't know, and you really talked about the composer and how he represents kind of more general Lithuanian investigation around circle of myth. That was very interesting. I'm very sorry that we should go to the Congress closure, but thank you very much.
Thank you.